Whenever an intact estate comes to auction or a collection comes to auction that's been formed over a number of years and is an old collection or an older collection, they always get a lot of attention. It doesn't matter what the culture is that it comes from. If it's been accumulated and built over a period of time and bought wisely and done with great research, and the items are all of the better quality, as they say. When they come to auction, they can get a lot of interest, and they get a lot more interest when it's from a museum, and a lot more interest on top of it when it's all being offered without a reserve, with modest estimates, and basically letting it fly. And what's happened is that the collection of Dr. Wou Kiuan, who built a significant Chinese art collection starting in the 1950s. He was a former Chinese government official, and then when the communists came in and took over, he left the government and he moved to London. He was educated in Paris. He was an interesting fellow. His father was Wu Lian Pai, and he named the museum that he established after his dad, who was a leading figure in the Republic period in China during the shifts that were taking place in the 1920s and so forth, 1915, 1920, 1930. And his dad was a very prominent guy, and actually sent Wu to go to school in the West. He went to college in Paris. He finished at the Sorbonne. He went back. He worked in the government a bit more, and then he was sort of forced into retirement in 1952 when China went to the Communist Party, and he retired and moved to London. He was allowed to leave, and he came over to London, and he devoted the rest of his life to building his collection. And from the 1950s through the 1960s and into the early 70s, he accumulated over 1,000 items, and he opened a private sort of museum in his home. He had a large home in London, and on the first floor was his museum, and he would open it up for visiting scholars, academics, collectors that really wanted to see the things. And the collection itself is quite phenomenal. A lot of the things that he bought came from great collections. He competed heavily with the major London firms at the time who were buying at auction and who sort of dominated the market. He was in there bidding against Spinks and all these old companies trying to get things for his collection. He managed to buy 3 or 4 of the best things that came through the Fonthill collection. They did a series of auctions in the 1960s and a second one around 1971, and he bought a number of the pieces from that collection, which had some of the finest Chinese art in the world within it, and he took it home. And his family has decided to auction the collection off. And it's going to be done over in a series of several auctions, starting with this one. And this auction took place on March 2nd. And now what was really fascinating about the auction was there was no catalog, there were no reserves. It was the only items being offered were his items. There were about 147 lots, and they were all being reasonably estimated, nicely photographed, with a lot of write-ups on it. And his main interest within his collection, he was a big fan of inscribed and dated material. And one of the things that he was able to do that gave him quite an upper hand was that when he was attending auctions back in the 50s and 60s in London and other places, he could read all the inscriptions, the archaic script that was on ancient bronzes and this kind of thing. So it gave him a bit of a leg up over the competition, and he was as a result able to buy some very significant things rather opportunistically. And this is his picture, He was an extremely bright man. There's a group shot of him here, and this was the Chinese foreign. This was a visit of the Chinese foreign minister to the Chinese embassy at the court of St. James, London, 1945. Dr. Wou Kiuan, standing fourth from right. He's right there. There he is. He's fairly tall. Any rate, these are some of the things. This is one of the vases that came from the Fonthill collection that will be auctioned in a later Sotheby sale. But we're going to get to the things that sold this time around because they did awfully well. This was a picture of his father, Wou Kiuan, and he was the government official that was involved in the Republic period's development, especially this picture. He was a government official actually prior to the collapse of the Qing dynasty. This is a picture of him taken in 1909, 3 years before the end. All right, but so how did it do? Well, that's the most interesting part. It started with lot number one, estimated at $4,000 to $6,000, sold for over $250,000. And here it is, and it's an inscribed archaic bronze food vessel, ritual food vessel cover. And the reason it brought so much money was the inscription on the interior. It dated to the Western Zhou dynasty, and there was an enormous amount of interest in it. Here's a picture of it standing on its base, and here's a picture of it upside down. All right, there it is. There was a huge amount of interest in it, obviously, and here's another shot of it standing on its upside down on its lid. Had a crack in the body and everything else, but rare form, and got an enormous amount of interest, mainly due to the inscription that was on the piece. And there's a good write-up here in the bottom that explains what the inscription says. It's the food Dewey cover illustrated in a book that was published during the Wan Li period. Here's a photograph of that cover. All right, and then there's a long write-up down below. I urge you to go over and read them. You really should, if you're interested in bronzes. And it talks a great deal about his the studying, the research that he did, and how he broke down the scripts and so forth. And this is a nice long history, and includes all the provenances, of course, that it had, its previous history, prior to getting into the museum. Okay, and went through. Last time it was sold at auction was London, 1958. It was lot number 80, and Dr. Wou Kiuan bought it, and then it was put in the Wou Kiuan Museum that he established in 1968. It went into the museum, and there's a good long write-up on it. Here's some more pictures and so forth, and it's well worth learning about, because it's not very often that just the cover to a bronze brings $264,000. It's quite something. And then over to this was a really rare late Western Zhou to early spring and autumn period dingware, and it also was inscribed, but in beautiful condition. This thing was in absolutely incredible condition. Almost looks new. It was done so well. The surface on it is perfect. It doesn't appear to have been disturbed in any way. It was estimated at $100,000 to $150,000 and sold for $567,000. And here again, there's a significant list of the literature and how many times this thing has been published, and references to it going back to 1916. And there's a long list of previous publication notes on it, and I think that had a lot to do with what it brought. I think people like to buy things that are published, pieces that have long, extensive histories of being published and written about, studied, because they become icons to certain types and certain forms. And this was one of them. And they had a modest estimate, no reserve. It says right there, no reserve. You'll see that little blue banner through this whole sale. 100% of the sale sold. And it went for $567,000. And then moseying along into the porcelain world, there was this, the Yongluo, they call these lotus bouquet dishes. And these were one of the signature styles of porcelains that were done during the Yongluo period. This is a very famous pattern. It was an extremely popular pattern. These were exported to the Middle East. These were used as trade goods and tributes to foreign leaders and so forth. And this was an absolutely stunning example This is a really splendid example, beautifully drawn. Very sinuous the way they did all of the vines and so forth. The flowers are painted meticulously. It's got that wonderful wave border going around the outside, and then vines and flowers and so forth. Absolutely a great thing. And this wasn't marked; these weren't marked typically, but it ended up going with a $100,000 to $150,000 estimate, which was a little bit conservative. And it sold for $453,000. And this is not an enormous dish. It's pretty good size though, 15 inches. So they made some that were a little bigger, but that's a hefty plate. And as a result, it brought a very, very strong price. But again, if you look at the history of it, it was bought at Christie's the last time around in 1972. Okay, and it ended up in the Wou Museum, and it was bought by Dr. Wou Kiuan. Here it is. This is sort of at the end of his collecting. All right, he didn't buy an awful lot after the early 1970s. And then over here to this. This was another big surprise. It was a jade marked Ming incense burner with Arabic script on them, and we've seen these before. And usually they have a Zhuangde mark on them, and they're from the Wanli, the late Ming period. This one is marking period Zhuangde, and was so it was made prior to 1521, because that's when the period ended. It had an $8,000 to $12,000 estimate, and it brought over 10 times its high estimate. It went for $126,000. And again, it comes down to the power of the provenance, the collection, and the man that owned it, as well as being marked period. And it doesn't say where or how he got it, who he got it from. So judging by this, the provenance was he bought it privately. There's no acquisition date on here, but it's an awfully beautiful bronze, and it was in also excellent shape, and marked here on the bottom. There's the mark, and the patina was good on it all the way through. It was undisturbed, and they got excited for it. And the same thing happened here with this archaic Qianlong period bronze. This was during the Qianlong period. They did a lot of reproductions of archaic bronzes. The emperor was fascinated by it. He would even take old bronzes that he had laying around the palace in the palace collection, and he'd send them off to the workshops to sort of provide inspiration for what he'd like to see more of. And they would innovate on the design sometimes of the archaic pieces and make things like this. And you have this partial gilt bronze lid with a beautifully done body. The high relief and low relief details on this were really quite excellent. Then you have these mythical heads, these sort of dragon heads framing around the top, and so forth. Estimated at 20 to 30,000, ended up selling for $163,000. And again, a bronze with no provenance. It just says he had it, and there was no record of where he got it and who he got it from. He might have bought it from a dealer, and he might have bought it at an auction somewhere, at some rural auction around England or someplace, and he just didn't for some reason they don't have a record of where and how he got it. And then on to this. I mentioned last week that it's a very similar pair of these style of bronzes that were done during the Qianlong period were produced for the palace in a lot of different sizes. They made some that were fairly small. They made some that were 3 feet tall. These were about 15 or so inches tall. Beautifully done, wonderful deep relief work. And they actually did these in 2 styles. They did them with dragons and they did them with phoenixes. And when they did them with dragons, they're supposed to be representative of the emperor. And in this scene, in these scenes, they show the dragons flying through the clouds on the body of the bronze here through the main section. And it's symbolic of the emperor, is symbolized by the dragon flying through the clouds or over the universe, over the domain, surveying everything under his control, indicating that he is the living God, overseeing all of the universe. And here you have this bronze. And sometimes they have them with phoenixes, and they were meant typically for the Empress or that kind of thing, around Empress Dowager in the palace. So if you see the phoenix, it's for the female, dragon for the male. And in this case, they did very well. They brought $504,000. We talked about them before the sale a little bit, and I thought that they'd probably get well beyond the estimate, because a similar smaller pair of these were 15 inches in height, right? 15 3/4, almost 16 inches tall. A very similar pair sold last year in London, nearly identical in design in many ways, but were only about 11 or so inches tall. Here they are. They're a bit smaller, a third smaller roughly, and they brought $327,000, also from a long-term collection. This sale was happened, I think, this was the estate of June Ruth Kerman, and I think the sale was last fall sometime, or last spring. I can't remember the date, but there it is. And it doesn't say on here when it was. You could look it up. It doesn't really matter. Any rate, there it is. It was bought by Garrett Kerman, who let's see, he died in 2012, and that was where this one came from. So, and here are the ones this time around, and they brought $504,000. They're a little bit larger, but also from a good collection, and haven't been on the market in a long time. And let's see, he bought these at Christie's in November 1959. Now that's interesting, because I remember the other pair that sold, Mr. Kerman, I believe he bought his also in the 1950s. 1957, yeah. So there must have been a few of them getting onto the market that year. All right. And now over to this. There was a very handsome pale green jade censer and cover. And it had a modest estimate, I think probably because it didn't have a mark on it and it wasn't inscribed or anything. But it was a very unusual form. And it got a lot of attention. And it was a $4,000 to $6,000 estimate. It ended up selling for $81,900. And this is all fascinating because there was no reserve. And he bought this also in 1959 at Christie's. So he was a customer at Christie's. There you go. He also bought at Sotheby's, but he bought wherever the stuff was. He's a true collector. And then on to this. This was a really rare bird. This is an extremely rare. It's a Jun imitation robin's egg glazed tripod flower pot, done during the Yongchen period under the supervision of Tang Ying. And these were fascinating because, of course, as we all know, these Jun pieces started to turn up in the late Sung to Yuan dynasty, and the emperor Yongchen was fascinated by these ceramics from that period, and as was Qin Lung after him. But they would make things for him to try to keep him entertained. And this was a Marken period Yongchen example. And the mark is on the back. It's hard to read. But if you... It's right here, but it's very hard to read. Let's see here. There should be I think there's a better picture of the mark. There. Now you can see the mark right there. So you can just see it, barely see it under the glaze. The glaze is a little too thick to see it dead on. So they put a little raking light across it when they took that picture so you could see the mark, and done in the Yongchen period. But what's interesting about this is the shape. The shape is quite innovative. This is not the typical shape of these nuts from the period. Tang Ying changed it a little bit and gave it a slightly more, I don't know what you'd call it, a little more modern looking foot and base on here, with these roux heads coming down and these carved skirts going around it. But the glaze was wonderful. And the robin's egg glaze was a little bit hard to do because it required a second firing, because after they fired the porcelain, they fired the pot, they had to fire it with the color on it, because but the color had to be fired at a lower temperature than the porcelain had to be fired to harden it and cure it. So they fired it once to harden up and get the porcelain squared away, then they enameled it and then refired it at a lower temperature. And that caused this wonderful flambe color. And this was estimated at $50,000 to $70,000, ended up blowing that away and bringing $214,000. And it sort of goes this way all day long. It's really fascinating. And then there was this Qing dynasty, Qinlong period vase. We had talked about it because I thought the estimate probably wouldn't hold up, because similarly decorated, similarly styled vases that have come up in the last couple of years have always brought over $80,000-$100,000 and up, and this one brought $107,000. But quite unusual, a very unusual vase, and nearly doubled its high estimate. It was 9 inches tall, and this one was bought at Sotheby's in 1964 for the collection. All right, and then on to this. This is something that a lot of people recognize. It's a Kangxi period birthday dish. And these dishes were done, scholars believe, they were done to celebrate the 60th birthday of the Kangxi Emperor, which would have been in 1714, right? Okay, I think it's I'm pretty sure it's 1714. Don't hold me to it, but I believe that was his 60th birthday. And these plates have been highly cherished, highly chased, and highly collected ever since they came on the market and people figured out what they are. But here you have a young lady presenting a peach, and then you have some mythical creature hauling the cart filled with rue scepters, and then the benevolent female deity holding a scroll looking back. But it's a beautifully done, beautifully done piece of porcelain. And in the end, the price was pretty beautiful. It was estimated at $8,000 to $12,000, which was, I think, and this was a market period dish too. There's the back of it. I think the estimate was a bit too low. Typically, they estimate these at I think more often in the $20,000 to $30,000, $30,000 to $40,000 range anyway. Anyway, for some reason they estimated this low, maybe just to encourage bidders. I don't know. When sometimes auction houses, when they have no reserves to worry about, they put in low estimates to really transmit the idea that there are no reserves. All right, and ended up selling for $107,100. So way over the estimate, almost 10 times its high estimate again. And then this was something that they had were hoping would do very well. Had a $400,000 to $600,000 estimate, but ended up selling for a little over $1 million. And it's a large imperial inscribed Liuhan boulder in the Qianlong period. And it was pretty good size too. It was like a foot. Yeah, it was over a foot tall. This was a big piece of jade. It wasn't 4 or 5 inches. This was over a foot tall. Great big piece of jade, beautifully carved. Absolutely beautifully carved, that sort of whitish gray stone. But the facial features, the way the robes are done, the staff, the fingers, all the little details are beautifully done. And the rock itself is meticulously carved out to simulate a boulder, that's been cracked open with a figure under it. And there's the inscription up top, and then there's more inscriptions down the right-hand side. And it ended up selling, as I said, for $1,071,000. There is, let's see, there's a collection of Madame Austin. He was sold by the Commissar-Priseur. That's the auction. Commissar-Priseur just means auction house. In 1962, so we bought it in Paris in 1962 at the Drouot, and ended up in his museum collection. There it is. All right. And, the funny part is that back in 1962, he probably paid $800 for this or something. Things have changed. All right, and then on to this, a really exceptional Neolithic period Liangzhu culture jade Kong. All right, and I thought the estimate on this also was low because the quality of the jade was so good and the quality of the carving was so good. Absolutely spectacular carving, beautifully done. There's some inclusions in the stone, as you can see, but the workmanship in that there's an aspect of the color of this jade which is just absolutely beautiful. And Neolithic Liangzhu jades are highly sought after. Most often when people see these Kong sections, they always tend to think of the Sung Dynasty or something else. But this is an early section, and it's only 2 inches wide. These are very, very small. And it ended up selling for $264,600, and he bought it in 1967 at Sotheby's. And again, he probably didn't pay a lot for it. But at any rate, there's a very good write-up on it. There's a wonderful write-up on the jade, what it means is, and they talk about the archaistic elements within the carving and so forth. Worth looking at. If you're a jade buyer, this is the kind of thing you really want to shoot for. Just a beautiful piece of stone, just absolutely elegant. Really is. And small. It's like a little gem, delicate, nice. And then moseying along over to this, there was this big bronze ritual vessel. They call them fang yis, made during the 12th century BC. And this sold. I remember that we talked about this before also, because it had a good history of a collection. Came to the Marines, the sale of Commissary Patrol, also at the Drouot, back in the 1950s. And again, the Drouot, if you don't know about the Drouot in Paris, if you're ever in Paris, go there. They run auctions. It's absolutely fascinating. And I was there a number of years ago, and I really enjoyed my day. There were, I think, 6 auctions going on at the Drouot at the same time, some crazy thing. And they go from room to room, they sell everything. And anyway, this bronze came from there. Long history of auctions in Paris through that place. And a beautiful example, great patina, crunchy, crusty, thick patina on this thing, all the way down. Beautifully patinated and undisturbed. And that's what one of the things that really get bronze guys, bronze collectors and women excited is completely undisturbed surfaces in pristine, shape, lots of corrosion. If you scrape that off, you don't have much left. At any rate, sold for $882,000, over $200,000 over its high estimate. And then on to this. This is a very interesting tally, or ufu. And this is something that needs a little explanation. It's sort of interesting. Let's see. First, we want to see how big is it. 3 7/8 inches long, so it's very small, and was made during the Qin dynasty or later. And what this is a tally. And the emperor, you notice it's in 2 sections. There's a line that splits it right here. There's 2 parts. And what the emperor would do is they'd pull this apart, and they would one half he'd hand to a general who was going out into the field to represent him somewhere, and he would have that in his possession, and it would indicate that he was there on behalf of the emperor. And then when the emperor built up enough confidence in him that he could make his own decisions and was always acting in the best interest of the imperial family, he would send him the second half that he kept behind. So the general would leave with one half, and then the emperor kept the other. And then when the time came, if it comes, he would have a courier bring him the second half, and the leader would put the 2 pieces together. And at that point on, he could speak directly. He could make decisions independently, let's put it that way, without being necessarily directed by the emperor, and that he had the full faith of the emperor in what he was doing. So it was a symbol of enormous power, because he became an independent voice, an independent spokesman for the imperial household in his roles. So this was a big deal, and there aren't many of these around. And this was estimated at $40,000 to $60,000. And ended up selling for $869,000, so about 14 times its high estimate. And this was something where this collector was able to, Dr. Wou Kiuan was able to look up these inscriptions, read them, break them down, and figure out everything that they had to say, and gave him a great advantage at buying it. And this was bought at Sotheby's in 1965. And they don't mention what he paid for it, but I'm going to bet it was a pretty modest amount of money. Anyway, and then on to this, an inscribed section of a bronze tally. Let's see here, we'll open this one up here. This is only one side, and this is sort of interesting. This is what it looks like from where it would mate together with the other side. He didn't have both sides, he just had this one. And Eastern Han Dynasty, again, another Hufu. And this one ended up selling for $50,400 because it's incomplete. It's not the full thing. But it was also estimated modestly at $4,000 to $6,000 and was 2 5/8 inches long. So it was a little bit smaller than the other one, but a very nice example. The surface on it was quite good. It had some good verdigris green in it and so forth. And this sold for $50,000. Then moseying over, this was one of the items. This was one of the big items of interest to a lot of scholars in the sale was this 3 hibiscus plate. There were 3 hibiscus flowers on here. We talked about it a couple of weeks ago when it came up. I just mentioned that it was going to be in the sale. Had I thought a very modest estimate of $100,000 to $150,000. Ended up selling for $453,000, and this was made during the early Ming Dynasty. They're not sure exactly when, because the styles that were used during the end of the Yuan Dynasty, they continued for a time into the Ming Dynasty, making them the same way. But this plate is particularly attractive. It's also used a number of times in different publications by the museum. They always show this plate because it's sort of an icon of the collection, and superbly well done. And it's not inscribed, which was interesting, but it's superb workmanship, beautifully polished all the way around. If you look at the polish on this and its condition for the age, is phenomenal. It doesn't have a lot of these old lacquer plates. When you look at them, they have these little cracks running in from the edge, running around the outside. They often have little cracks on the lacquer. And on this one, I think there's only 2. There's down here. There's a little section with there's 3 and 4 of them, but not 50 of them. Which so for on a condition standpoint, this is pretty remarkable. This is in really remarkable shape, and ended up selling for $453,000. And it was just 10 inches in diameter. This was not a charger or anything. This was about a dinner plate size item. And then on to this, the underglazed red and blue dragon base. And this is unusual for a few reasons. One is the shape is rare. It's a rare shape. The red came out very well on this. All right, there's some underglazed blue, just uses outlines down here at the bottom around the base, and a few at the top. Okay, and that's about it. But the underglazed red on this came out really well. And as we've talked about before, was that when they were firing porcelain with underglazed red and underglazed blue, it was a bit tricky because they both need to be a certain amount of time fired at different temperatures. So what happens is, if it's not done right, the underglazed red sometimes will turn green. And if you look at this carefully, you'll see areas of slight hints of green here along the spine of the dragon. And that's what happens if the red doesn't quite get the right temperature all the time. You get these little green areas. I've even seen vases that are completely green with the dragon, like this. I saw a pear-shaped vase like this years ago, and the whole body was green. All the decoration had turned green in the firing process. So here you have one where the red came out extremely well for the period. And there was estimated, I don't know why they estimated it so low, maybe because it wasn't marked or something. They estimated $8,000 to $12,000 and brought $94,000. And there's a very nice shot of the bottom of it, of the foot rim, to give you an idea of what it should look like. There it is. Again, those foot rims are big indicators when you're looking to authenticate something. And he bought this at Christie's in 1965. And it only measured 10 inches tall, and it sold for $94,500. And then over to this. This was a small, a lemon yellow Yongchen market period cup. And what was unusual, the color of this is quite unusual. It's a very unusual color, as is the form and the shape of the cup, this bell form. Typically, the Yongchen cups were straighter, and they didn't have that flare to the rim. They just went straight up, and the body is a little more straightened out. Also, the color on here is a very, very lovely color. There was some porcelains that turned up a year or two ago. We did a video on them. Similar color, also did extremely well. And this cup was estimated at $100,000 to $150,000. Ended up selling for $220,500. But one of the things it had going for it too was the way the mark was done. The mark was done inside of a rectangular form with canted corners. This is a very unusual treatment, and you'll also notice from the foot rim, you'll notice that the foot rim where it's unglazed here is absolutely white. It's absolutely pure, beautiful, beautiful quality porcelain. No inclusions, no iron oxide lines, none of that stuff. Absolutely pure porcelain, and a beautiful color, splendid color all the way around. And most of the cups and the yellows they used back then were egg yolk yellow. So lemon yellow was quite an innovation, and was never really widely adopted. You see lemon yellow coming back in on copies these days and on later Republic pieces, but they also had them on occasion in the Yongchen period. But most of the lemon yellow cups you see floating around, and they do turn up, are repros trying to emulate these because these are so popular. And this was bought at Christie's in 1964 for the museum, for the collection. And then on to this. This was an extremely rare plate, and it's a gardenia dish from the Yongchen period. But what's interesting about it is that the style is based, many of you will recognize this, is based on early Ming types, where they would do the background in blue, but they do the flowers in white. And that's typically how they did them during the Ming period. And under the supervision of Tang Ying, working for the Yongchen emperor, he decided to try doing the background in yellow, which was quite a change, and created a very different look. And here's a picture of the mark on the back, beautifully drawn. And here's a picture of the bottom of the plate. And you can blow it up and get a good look at the foot rim on it. It's exactly how it should look. The foot rims on these look very similar naturally to the foot rims that you see on Kangxi dishes. And sometimes people go back and forth with, they see this foot rim and they'll say it's either Yongchen or Kangxi, and that's why, or Kangxi or Yongchen. And that's, if it's not marked, sometimes the lines can get a little bit blurred. But at any rate, this is the back of it. And it ended up doing very well. It's selling for $277,000, about 2.25 times, 2.5 times over its high estimate. It measured 13.25 inches in diameter. But a very rare color combination. There are other examples of these known, but there's not a lot of them. There's a couple in the Palace Museum. I think there's one in a museum in Scotland, and a few others. And that's about it. So again, rare type. Bought over 50 years ago, unreserved, bang, good price. And then the last thing we're going to talk about is this. I just thought this was great. It had a really low estimate, $8,000 to $12,000, a Jun glazed ear cup, either Northern Sung or Yuan, more likely Yuan. Most of these Jun pieces are now ascribed to the Yuan dynasty, but they're still saying Sung to the Yuan. And the ear cup, of course, is a style that was a wine vessel. It was for drinking wine. The handles on the sides, you could pick it up, and it was a ritual thing. But beautifully glazed. And this form and style, of course, has been around since the Eastern Zhao in the ancient times, BC, 400 BC, that kind of thing. And they can find these ear cups, as they're known now. They were done in bronze. They were done in lacquer, done in porcelain, and so forth. Later on they even did them in jade occasionally. But this was one that was done in stoneware with a Jun glaze all over it, and ended up going for 15 times over its high estimate. Went for $151,200, which I don't think is unreasonable because these pieces are exceedingly rare. And if you look up Jun ear cups, in the museum collections, you're going to have to dig a long time to find one. I don't know if they provided almost no information about this, other than it was the property of a gentleman and was bought at Christie's in 1964. And curiously, they didn't do any write-up on it. There's no paper with this. And I thought that was kind of strange. I don't know why they did that. But at any rate, the people that buy them know exactly what it is, and they went after it and ended up, making short work of that estimate and ended up buying it. And in the end, the entire collection sold. Everything they put up sold. The gross for the wholesale was around $10 million, which is very, very respectable for 147 lots. And here they all are. You can go over, you can go through them. There were other things worth talking about, too. And not everything went for crazy money. Because it was unreserved, there were a few things that went reasonably. There was a nice pair of carved wooden Ming Dynasty ducks that were estimated at $5,000 to $7,000. I think they went for $1,500 or $2,000. And on another page over here, everything sold. But there were a number of things that sold for under $5,000 or $6,000 toward the end. Some little small jades and bits like that. So it's always worth checking, because if you can get something from a collection like this, it's so good to have the provenance. There it is. Here's the pair of ducks, $2,500. They were estimated at $12,000 to $15,000. Somebody got a great buy on those. And I think this amber glazed tang pot with lid was also an excellent buy for $3,000. So for people that know to leave bids, this is why you leave them. Even if you leave a low bid and it seems ridiculous, you might surprise yourself. All right, and there were a few of those in here. This pair of Northern Wei Dynasty attendants, estimated at 10 to 15,000, which is about right. For some reason, these went for $3,780. Okay, so there were things in there that would that most collectors or a lot of collectors could afford to buy. Because they're under $5,000 for a good item with great provenance, and that has a lot to do with the quality of a collection over time, especially because you can point to who's owned it before, and that gets people excited as long as you hang on to the paperwork. Don't lose your paperwork for these items, because you're going to want them later if you go to sell something. All right, and that was it for that sale, but I wanted to talk about it because it had everything going for it. A longtime collector, scholarly collector, well-liked, well-regarded, member of a prominent Chinese family, well-known in London for a long time, active during the big heydays of buying Chinese art in England, was in the 1950s and 60s. That was when an enormous amount of it came onto the market, and it was most of the auctions were attended by dealers more than collectors. The dealers dominated the scene in London for a long time, and sort of owned it. And there were, though, people like this fellow who was out there with them, swinging for the fences and buying as well. And he built up one heck of a collection, and we're going to see more of it during the year. But you notice that, again, no reserves, no catalog. They did a number of good write-ups about it, explaining who the collection was coming from. But other than that, they didn't do a lot of other stuff, and people went wild for this collection overall. There were a couple of bargains, which keeps everybody happy, and for the most part, everything did exceedingly well. And one of the things to always remember is that even if out of a collection, when you're auctioning a collection, even if one or two things go under the wire, go inexpensively, overall, on average, as a seller, you're gonna make a lot more money, because you're going to have things that go high, because you're going to elicit interest from people who might not be interested otherwise. They get excited about owning it because it's got a low estimate, and then they forget about the estimate and they just keep bidding anyway because they decided they want to own it. And that's the psychology of it. Nothing brings in a crowd more than an unreserved auction of high-end items, and this was a classic case. So there we are. All right. Well, listen, that's it for this video. We have the regular video this week also, but I wanted to get this out, and we're going to take a look at some of the other sales that are going on as well. There were some other nice surprises in there. That dice bowl did very well as predicted, and some other things, and the snuff bottle collection did well, and we'll do a video on those next week. All right, some of the lots are still closing, so that's why I haven't done it yet. But this auction is over and done a couple of days ago. All right. Thanks for watching, and have a great rest of your week. Subscribe if you haven't done so with us over here on YouTube, and visit us over at bidamount.com. All right. Bye-bye.